Is it working? Hi, buenas tardes. Thank you for the invitation, and I hope you enjoy the next presentation. So I'm going to talk. This is technical problems. They happen after lunch. So I'm going to talk about the regulations in European Union. The first part of the presentation is about contaminants in general, and the second part is about pesticides. So cover generally the European Union regulation framework, focus on how they're making decision points, what are the areas of concern, and what are the projects they're working in last year and this year as well. Then explain a bit about the EU pesticides framework, and present a couple of recent data from the reports that we published about 2 months ago for surveys. So what the EU defines as contaminants, the specifically substances that have not been intentionally added to food, and the effect could be potentially negative or extremely harmful to public health. Sources could be natural, environmental, could be during production, could be during packaging, could be during storage or transport. So generally, the European Union sets levels for mycotoxins at the moment, heavy metals, dioxins, PCBs, PAH, H3, MCPD, melamine, erucic acid, and nitrates. And this is what comes under the contaminants framework. Generally, the rules is really that food containing a level of contaminant is generally not acceptable, and that goes through various toxicity studies. So the maximum levels are set for contaminants of greater concern are due to the toxicity or the prevalence in the environment, and they always take account on the national diets of every country state. The levels are set on base of scientific advice, and for imported foodstuffs, the country of origin is the sole responsible for the compliance. So when you planning to export to the EU framework, then the strict import rules with respect to food and hygiene are applied, and they have to fulfill exactly the same standards as the standards applied to food that has been produced or farmed within the European Union. The importer is also responsible to comply with all the requirements of the products that they're going to go into the market. And there is a bit of a difficult point because there are some member states and some areas that they have even stricter requirements, and therefore you need to be very much aware where the product is going to be marketed. Member states, from their part, they are responsible for the implementation and verify and maintain the surveillance to ensure that the food and the border controls are in order. And quite a differentiating point from at least the USA regulation, to my knowledge, that there's no need of an import broker or an agent when you export to the European Union. The two basic regulations that you need to refer to if you're interested in contaminants and see the compliance. First of all is the Council Regulation 31593, which is pretty much set the food safety rules, and in terms of food containing a contaminant to an amount unacceptable should not be placed in the market. And then, of course, it sets various other conditions. And the Commission Regulation 2023-915, it's the one that sets the maximum levels. This is a very, very new regulation. It was only been enforced about a month ago, and it replaced the regulation that 1881-2006 that's been enforced for several years. The update is pretty much to summarize all the changes that have happened in the last 10 years, and also expand to some product categories and set new limits for some environmental contaminants, or some process contaminants like melamine. There are only like 2-3 areas that summarize as areas of concern in the EU when it comes under the contaminants regulation, and I would expect it to be updated probably in the next year or the next 2 years. Mycotoxins is always an area of concern. the levels have been changing quite a lot. They have been reviewed, especially for nuts and spices, in the last years. The reason is because prevalence is very much related to climate change and environmental conditions and unexpected weather patterns because the natural toxins. Daily consumption is very much taken into account when a risk assessment is done for mycotoxins. And we have a lot of changes in our habits. We consume more vegetable sources, foods. There's a growing trend of vegans and vegetarians, and therefore, potentially, the consumption of natural toxins has increased in a daily diet, and also changes in the global trading rules affect the daily consumption. Pyrrolidazine alkaloids, a very complex area, quite a wide group of natural plant toxins. Limits have been enforced primarily for dried herbs and spices, but also for tea infusions and any other hot drinks that come from herbs and they're being consumed within the European Union. The limits, they've been discussed for a long time, but actually they became applicable for about a year ago. Broadly, the biggest issue for pyrrolidazine alkaloids is contamination in the crop, because they come from plants that they grow at the same fields where herbs are grown. And this is how usually they come into the food supply chain. And this is the area where most of the research is focused now, and is a very, very wide category of persistent organic pollutants. These are contaminants, industrial chemicals. It could be pesticides such as DDT. It could be various dioxins, plasticizers, and other contaminants that have a common characteristic. And this characteristic is that they take very, very long to break down in the environment. Some people call them forever chemicals, and we becoming more and more aware about the toxicity and the issues on the animal and human health. And from this category, this is the area of research. Is the fluorinated compounds, PFAS. Regulatory limits for the first time were established in the EU this January. Extremely low level limits. Usually they come from land that has been farmed and is very close to industrial areas. And recent big issues in countries like France or Germany or Belgium, it was close to land that's been farmed, but there was flooding, so the soil changed. They were doing excavations for various other projects, and they brought this certain of chemicals into the surface, and then they entered the food supply chain, either through the water or through the feed, and then through the animals, because we find quite a lot in eggs, in dairy, and in liver and fatty fish as well. So everything else that is not covered by contaminants is covered by the pesticides regulation. So that's a very big distinction between what is classified as a contaminant and what is classified as what it comes under the pesticide acts within the EU. So I'm a chemist by background, so I talk many times about pesticides in the lab, and we know that we kind of cover a very, very wide range, which makes detection, implementation, regulations very, very difficult to understand and interpret sometimes, because the properties are very, very different and very wide. So the definition is there to cover anything that prevents, destroys, or controls a harmful organism. As you can imagine, that's as broad as it gets. Then, obviously, we differentiate between pesticides and plant protection products. And from us, when we're doing detection studies and when we're doing testing in the lab, actually, what we focus is the last part is the active substance, because this is what we try to detect. Sometimes it could be its metabolite or the decomposition chemical product, but the active substance is the one of interest, and it's the one that we always go back and refer into the regulations to see if there's a compliance issue. The 4 stages of how pesticides can be approved or not, or reapproved within the European Union. And generally, this is a never-ending process, because especially for the last decade, and it's set to go to the next decade as well, there's a lot of licenses that they have expired or they're about to expire. And there's a big lag between assessing new data, getting all the member states to agree on the toxicity levels, update the regulation, and then make it implemented. So it's a big, big project currently that all the European countries are involved. but the steps are always the same. So first of all, the European Food Safety Authority will do the risk assessment, and it's a process that can take anything from a year to several years and more than 10 years in some cases, especially when it comes to area approval. Based on the toxicity data, prevalence, diets, is going to set or propose what the maximum residue limits can be for the pesticide of interest. If that gets accepted by every member state, then it becomes a responsibility for the national authorities to take over control of the borders and perform the surveillance studies that they have to do, the sampling exercises that they do every year. And these sampling exercises have two components. There is a big part, of course, of food that is being imported into the EU, but also there's a big part of the food that's being grown within the EU. And then we have the non-EU imported crops, which crops are grown outside. MRs are set on request of the exporting country. And countries, exporting countries are also welcome to provide scientific data on prevalence. Similar to the contaminants, on pesticides, there's two main regulations that they continuously be updated. The first one, 1107/2009, is about the product placement, what can be in the market and for what crops can be used. The second one is the one that contains all the maximum residue limits. And I have to say from experience, the second one, it's not an easy regulation to read. It's many, many pages with a lot of notes, with lots of appendices, and quite difficult to get to the end of it. So the easiest way to do is to use the EU database. It's a free database. It's the most up-to-date tool you have in order to be able to understand which are active substances, when the license expires, when it's due for approval, what is in what food products it applies, what is the definition of the residue, and what the limit applies with its definition to the specific product. An ongoing project that I keep telling in every presentation I do that in next month we're going to have an update. This deadline has not moved for about 7 months, so maybe we'll have an update, is glyphosate. The approval has been delayed for very, very long. The FSA, we expected a conclusion next month. It doesn't mean that whatever the conclusion is next month, something is going to change in July, because the conclusion then needs to be accepted by every country. It will be debated again, and it's a very, very hotly debated topic within Europe, and that's why it has taken so long. But we'll see. The estimate, unofficially, is that if we get an opinion published next month, we should have a finalized opinion before the end of the year, purely because it has taken so long to get to that stage. But it's a watch this space area. On the monitoring program, the European Union has a border alert system, the rapid alert notification system, the RASAP, which actually allows all the countries and exporting countries to freely raise notifications and alerts for any potential food safety issue or food hazard. And this is really a useful tool also to see whether alerts coming from which parts of the world, whether consumption has changed, and which areas you need to focus your risk assessment. I have some data. It says 2021, but the report was only published 2 months ago, so there is a bit lag between having the data, going through approval, and actually publishing them. I can see the graphs from the RASAF, they're not appearing very clear, but basically the biggest part of the notifications in 2021 has been areas of concern. And then these are the categories of the alerts, so I can drive you through the quite blurry screen. The second bars you see here, they're all microbiology, and traditionally, pathogens is the biggest area of concern on imports and exports. All the other bars are chemistry related. This one here is pesticides. Traditionally, pesticides and mycotoxins, they're the two areas of product recall in the borders or food safety alert. Based on the same report, this is a more detailed breakdown of where the areas of issues are. Obviously, the more you export to the EU, the more likely you may have a non-compliance as well. It's a volume-based assessment. Turkey has been the country that has been on the top of the list for many years. Biggest issue from memory, I think it's grapes and some dried fruit. And as you see, after pesticides, there's going back into more traditional salmonella related issues. And then we have pesticides again from India, Egypt, and aflatoxins. If I had to look back when we start tracing these reports about 10, 12 years ago, this picture was completely different because all you had on the table was aflatoxins and salmonella. Now you get to see more and more pesticides. You also get to see allergens as well coming up, especially sulfites. Breaking down by pesticides of concern, the two categories, because this is chlorine PFOS here, and that's this methyl metabolite, and then ethylene oxide. So there's two residues of concern that cause the biggest amount of alerts in 2021. The trend is looking the same for 2022. And there's a reason why we had these two areas. And I'll explain a bit later. Getting the data, kind of focusing a bit down, a bit more in depth, and seeing the alerts between 2021 and June, so 2.5 years worth of data from Ecuador. The spread that you see is kind of similar to the generic summary spread that you see if we take account of all the alerts within the EU. So there's nothing really unusual to see here. It is expected, especially with such a big seafood producing country, the microbiology to be a big area of concern. And also, it's no surprise that pesticides is a second area because these are the two categories that are affected based on what is being imported in the EU. What I have put as other, there's a combination of issues. It could be traceability issues, wrong labeling, not proper storage. It should be frozen, not sealed, and also some plant products that they're not approved for consumption in the EU, and they had to go through novel foods regulation. Another kind of level down to bring it a bit more relevant to the day, bananas who actually in 2022, they account about for half of the alerts when it comes to EU exports, and we have mainly two pesticides, chlorpyrifos and imazalil. It's hard to say how 23 would look. At the moment, actually, the alerts, there's not any relevant pesticides alerts for bananas, but these two are the prevalence pesticides. I would assume that this and aluminum sulfate is an additive and probably is an isolated incident. Why then we see so many recalls across the borders with chlorpyrifos and ethylene oxide? It's quite an easy answer. On the first one, it's because it's been widely used as an insecticide. The review was completed in 2019 because the license had expired. There have been several concerns from all the European Union member states that they were fed to the FSA about the neurologic effects. Based on the data they have, it was impossible for the authorities to agree a maximum residue limit because they could not establish a safe exposure limit. And because they could not establish a safe exposure limit, the approval was not renewed. So this pattern that an approval is not renewed, and for probably 1, 2, 3, sometimes 4 years later, we see many alerts, is not an unusual pattern. So although there's a trend there, it's something that we see for many other residues as well. Ethylene oxide, it was quite and still is a big issue with the EU. In fact, ethylene oxide has been the biggest food product recall down to pesticides in the last 15 years. So it's been widely used as a fumigant. It's a genotoxic carcinogen, and it hasn't been possible again to establish a safe level, and therefore it has been banned. So contamination was first found in India, Indian origin sesame seeds. That was the easy part. What we found later on in the last 2-3 years is that actually the biggest issue was with carob and locust gum, which are used as food additives. So there's been a huge issue detecting ethylene oxide in anything from sesame, from spices, dry herbs, to actually ice cream, dried pasta, and products actually was also quite difficult to test. No compliance for ethylene oxide includes its metabolite. It's a critical topic for many people that have issues with detection. And we're fairly confident, having seen the first half of the year, that this issue is here to stay for at least this year, because it started from India, it expanded all across Asia, and now we see imports from other parts of the world as well. And then it gets to even a bit more complicated regulated environment. This is quite a headache, even for me. I'm Greek, I live in the UK, so I have one leg in the EU, one leg in the UK. What regulation applies where? Not a clear answer, because the UK is compiled of the Great Britain, GP, that has England, Wales, and Scotland, and then you have Northern Ireland. So what regulation you apply, it depends where you're going to export your product. If your product is going to end up in Northern Ireland, you must comply with EU laws. And that's a hard answer there, and that's it. If the product is going to come to GB, England or Wales or Scotland, then GB laws applied. Up to 2 years ago, there was a complete alignment, because Great Britain pretty much copy-pasted all the EU law into their law. So no differentiation. But what we see since then is that, especially in residues, as license expire, there's more and more deviation between the countries. At the moment, a kind of a easy answer, and it's a bit my opinion based on what we see and how the deviation is, if the product is compliant with European Union regulation, it still should not have a problem being consumed in GB, because for some residues, especially for some neonicotinoids, now one of it has expired, so it can be used in England, but it cannot be used in the EU. So if you stay with the EU MRS, at the moment, you still should be covered. Similar to the European Union database, there is a database dedicated to Great Britain MRLs. It's published by the Health and Safety Executive in the UK. And again, it's really the same concept, approvals, authorizations, and everything takes place and published real time there. An area that many people, and this is kind of a sideline into the regulation, and just to close the presentation, an area that many people forget sometimes, or they don't check when they do a risk assessment, and when they find exceedances, especially in MRS, is fraud and authenticity issues. Because we're very good on detecting or not detecting contaminants and pesticides when we know that it's straight from the crop, and it's easy to see that it is what it says it is. However, sometimes from the place of production to the place of consumption, there's many, many steps, there's a lot of mixing, and there's a lot of people involved. And then we end up with scenarios that actually we identify and we find residues or other contaminants in the product that they had nothing to do with how the product started. And this is all a kind of a big circle of food fraud that becomes more and more complex, and we get many, many detections. Actually, ethylene oxide, in some areas that we saw that, it was related to fraud because there were herbs and spices mixed. Something was organic, something wasn't organic, it was backed up, and we started detecting that. How we can help as SGS is not only the testing, it's compliance, labeling services, and auditing. In fact, although my background is all testing, testing is not the wholly solution for everything. It's just another tool, and you need to be able to combine many different approaches in order to ensure compliance. work a lot with my colleagues in SCSDC Comply. It's a monitoring database. It's something we use to identify any issues in the supply chain and also get all the data, all the regulatory data online, and it's something that widely we offer as a service. And with that, I'll just close the presentation, and we have, I think, some time for questions. If you have any questions, I will need it with translation. Thank you.